online discourse surrounding The Last of Us Part 2 has been crazy to say the least. A lot of people who either think it's a masterpiece or the worst game ever made. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance to the discussion of this game, but it's unfortunate how those with more thought-out critiques are drowned out by all the noise. This game and the discourse surrounding it has been on my mind for a while, so I felt an urge to make a video. A video where I'll go in depth about how I felt about this game, and also address some common criticisms that I think are over-exaggerated, wrong, or that I just fundamentally disagree with. I know I'm 6 months late, but let's start from the very beginning. Before the game had even come out, Part 2's story leaked online. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing someone try to spoil the game's story. It got so out of control that Sony had to turn off all the comments to all their social media accounts. Eventually, Sony even started DMCA YouTube videos where people were just simply talking about the leaks, which was incredibly ridiculous. In no way does a YouTube video where someone is simply talking about story leaks warrant a DMCA takedown. Sony had crossed a line, and it definitely wasn't a good look. Now you might be asking, well, why were so many people trying to spoil the game's story? There were definitely those of who just did it for the fun, but a lot of people try to justify their actions by saying they were diehard fans of the first game, and that the leaks for Part 2 showed that it would be a completely garbage sequel, and therefore spoiling it for others to maybe stop them from purchasing the game is justified. This is obviously a bullshit excuse to just be a dick, not to mention the reasoning was solely based off leaks that were unconfirmed, and now that the game has been out for like half a year, some of those leaks actually turned out to be false. Even if these people did actually play the game all the way through and still came to the same conclusion, that's still not an excuse to try and ruin the experience for others. When reviews poured in from critics where they were all collectively praising the game as a 10 out of 10, the people who were upset about the leaks, of course, wrote the critics off as being bought off by Sony, and in retaliation, bombarded the audience scores for sites such as Metacritic. This was when the discourse started to become uncivil, and the game hadn't even come out yet. As someone who read the leaks before playing the game, I know part of the main purpose of playing a Naughty Dog game is to experience the story, but this is still a video game. You know, the most interactive medium on the planet where you get to control a character in this thing called gameplay. Even if someone was able to fully grasp a game's narrative through a couple story leaks, you still have to play the game to critique it fairly. So when these people bombarded review sites with scores like 0 to 10, it didn't just come off as childish, but it made anyone who was heavily criticizing the game look like they were unreasonable. It was baffling how these people were so confident in claiming that The Last of Us Part 2 is a bad game when they haven't even played it. At least the critics actually did. It did become obvious rather quickly that a huge chunk of the people who were angry about The Last of Us Part 2 weren't actually angry about the story, they were angry over the game's representation. Holy shit, the amount of dudes I've seen online say dumb shit like, "This body type is biologically impossible for a woman to have," is literally insane. First of all, no it's not. Just go to a bodybuilder's gym and I guarantee you'll find at least one woman that looks like this. Well, maybe don't go to the gym right now because of the pandemic, but there are definitely women that look like this. It's not like Naughty Dog created Abby out of thin air either. She's modeled after a real-life gymnast, so anyone who claims that this is biologically impossible doesn't deserve to be listened to. What's worse is that these people were so angry with the game, and again, let me reiterate, many of whom didn't even play it, started sending death threats to the people who worked on it. Not only was the discourse uncivil, it became straight up toxic. What also sucks is that the people like me found themselves defending this game constantly, not because I love the game or anything, but because the majority of criticism levied at the game was either unreasonable, unfair, or just wrong. Next time a game has its story leaked, don't listen to the mob. Find critics you trust and see what they have to say. But if you're still not sure and you have the money, just buy it yourself. Usually when I'm critiquing a piece of media, I like to have a spoiler-free section at the beginning, then afterwards a spoiler section. There's a lot I have to say, and with how this game structured its story, as well as me needing to talk about Part 1, it'd just be easier if I tackle this game with a spoiler warning already in mind. So if you don't want to know literally anything about The Last of Us 1 or 2, here's your warning. 3, 2, 1. It's become alarmingly apparent that a lot of people have the wrong interpretation of the first game's ending. The Last of Us ended with Joel kidnapping Ellie from the Fireflies. Her immunity to the virus was a beacon of hope that might have been the cure humanity needed. The catch, however, for even being able to try and develop a vaccine, was that Ellie would have to die. Throughout Part 1, Joel develops a father-daughter bond with his foul-mouthed 14-year-old girl. A character that started off as a broken man who wanted nothing to do with this little girl, became less broken, willing to do anything to protect her. Seeing this relationship develop in real time is what made Part 1 such a hit. A character template that's even echoed through games that come out today. When Joel is told that Ellie will die from the surgery, it's immediately obvious to the player that he's not going to let that happen. So when he goes on a rampage to save her, we know why, because he views her as his daughter. That's also why he lies to her at the end, because he knows he could lose her if she knew the truth. This is what made the ending so good. The ambiguousness to what extent Ellie knows Joel's lying is perfect, which is why I would have been completely happy if Naughty Dog ended Ellie and Joel's story right here. However, through the release of Part 2, it became apparent that there's a lot of people that think what Joel did here makes him a hero. I would honestly say this is objectively the wrong way to interpret the ending. Not only is Joel not supposed to be looked at as a hero, he's not even supposed to be viewed as a good person. Taking Ellie to the Fireflies is probably one of the only selfless acts Joel has committed since the outbreak. The apocalypse forces you to do shitty things to survive, a sentiment that is echoed through the scene.
What are we doing here? This is not us.
What do you know about us? About me?
I know that you are smarter than this.
Really? Guess what? We're shitty people, Joel. It's been that way for a long time.
No, we are survivors.
This is our chance.
It is over, Tess!
Quote-unquote saving Ellie doesn't make Joel a hero, because by saving her, he's literally forsaking humanity's only chance at a cure. And sure, you could say that it wasn't a guarantee or that the Fireflies should have at least asked Ellie what she wanted, but not only does the game hint that Ellie probably would have consented,
It ain't for you to decide.
It's what she'd want. And you know it.
it doesn't even really matter. What are the Fireflies supposed to do? Not take this chance to possibly save humanity? I've seen some people justify Joel's actions by saying, well, even if a vaccine was made through Ellie's sacrifice, that doesn't mean that people won't just fight over the vaccine, or that the world would go back to normal, or even that humanity is even worth saving. Okay, it's true that we don't know how expansive the manufacturing would have been, so people fighting over the vaccine is definitely a possibility. It's a possibility that could have happened, sure, but the way the story presents the choice leads me to believe it's just a choice between saving Ellie or humanity. As for people who played part 1 all the way through and came to the conclusion that humanity isn't worth saving, that's like the whole point of the game. Not having the ending be a player choice between having to sacrifice Ellie or saving her isn't the game indirectly saying that Joel's choice was righteous. The ending happens that way because that's what the character would do, selfishly forsaking humanity and lying to Ellie so he can have her as a surrogate daughter. It's actually pretty fucking shitty when you think about it. But with that being said, that's what makes Joel such a compelling character. I think with this misguided interpretation of Part 1's ending, had a lot of people go into Part 2 with the wrong mindset. Speaking of, let's finally start talking about The Last of Us Part 2. Part 2 starts off with Joel telling Tommy about the Fireflies. When I first saw Joe's face in this scene, I thought, holy shit, that's a real person. Remember when games used to look like this? Admittedly, there's still bits of Uncanny Valley going on, but we're pretty much at a point where video game graphics can convincingly convey reality, which is phenomenal when you consider that this plays on a 7-year-old console that currently costs $200. As someone who owns a $3,000 high-end PC, believe me when I say this is the most graphically impressive game I've ever played. Too bad about the game's frame rate though. Part 2 continues directly where Part 1 left off. Joel and Ellie now live in Jackson. After riding back with Tommy, Joel visits Ellie, in what is one of the game's best scenes.
Jesus. Almost gave me a heart attack.
I tried knocking, but
Hey,
hey,
what's up, Joel?
just checking in.
After everything that's happened between these two, this interaction is understandably kind of awkward. An awkwardness that is brilliantly conveyed through Troy Baker's and Ashley Johnson's performance, with the help of state-of-the-art motion capture. It's really cool how now we can see all the subtle nuances from an actor's or actress's performance, and I find it to be very exciting. Also, I'm glad that they remodeled Ellie's face so it doesn't look like Elliot Page anymore. That was something that was super distracting in the last game. This scene introduces a rhythm mechanic that you'll get to play a few times throughout the game. It's one of the very few times I've seen a developer actually use the PS4's touchpad for something other than just the map button, though Naughty Dog does use it as that later. Utilizing the touchpad to emulate guitar strings is super creative, and it's not just a simple stroke with a finger. Each section of the touchpad represents each individual string. There are plenty of videos on YouTube where you can see people use this mechanic to play actual songs. So hey, even if you don't like the game, at least it's a decent guitar simulator. This scene overall is very heartfelt, but as Joel leaves, the camera pans on Ellie where it's clear that she is suspicious of him, as she should be given the circumstances. The game's title card appears, alongside some eerie music, foreshadowing what's to come. We then jump forward 4 years where an older Ellie has an awkward interaction with a guy named Jesse.
Hey,
Morning.
sorry, I totally overslept. Just give me a minute and I'll get dressed.
I heard you had quite a night after I left.
She kissed me. It was just Dina being Dina. She didn't mean anything by it.
I was talking about your fight with Seth. Wait, you kissed Dina?
Oh,
This is really jarring. The game just went from a scene that's a fantastic setup for what's to come to what I can only describe as dumb teen drama. Who is this guy? What's his relationship with Ellie? Who's Dina? What's her relationship with Ellie? Why'd she kiss Ellie? What night are they talking about? These are really weird questions to have the player be asking right after what we just saw in the introduction. I guess Joel and Ellie were able to settle into the Jackson community. Not saying that's impossible, just that considering how many bad interactions Joel and Ellie had with strangers in the last game, it would have been good to showcase the incorporation of them in this community. The next 10 to 20 minutes are fairly dull as you walk through Jackson and see how this community functions. You do get to pet a dog though. The next scene again has characters referencing a night that you have no context for. If the goal here was to make the player invested by having them curiously wonder what happened, I think it was poorly done. Also, for this being a crowded bar, it sure doesn't sound like it.
no. Where's Maria?
In the back.
If you look around before you leave, you'll find a trading card. These are cards with detailed character profiles of made-up superheroes. Collecting these doesn't add anything substantial to the game's story, but they are a nice side activity you can do throughout the game. I personally really like the character designs. Though I do think the game's director, Neil Druckmann, self-inserting himself on one of the cards as a self-described mad scientist that pushes people past their limits is a little cringe. Especially if this is referring to Naughty Dog's horrible working conditions. Which if it is,
Yikes! That's gonna be a fucking yikes from me, holy shit!
you meet up with Dina and snowball fight with a bunch of kids. Not sure if there really was any other purpose to this other than, it's cute. Afterwards, you and Dina head out on patrol. Considering that Jackson is a community that Joel and Ellie just spent the last 4 years in, it's strange that Naughty Dog doesn't really want to utilize it. Because from this point forward, the Jackson community is pretty much irrelevant. Maybe it's just me, but I think there was a missed opportunity here to use this setting as a way to teach the player how to play, while also learning how Joel and Ellie have settled in these last 4 years. For example, maybe there could be like a shooting range that Ellie goes to weekly that she uses to train her aim. And there she could reminisce with the Jackson residents about how the community's doing. What I just described is something the game actually does later for a community that gets a lot more development, so I just wonder why Jackson wasn't given the same treatment. Now it's time for Abby, the internet's favorite character. If you went into this game oblivious of the leaks, then at this point you're probably asking, who are these people and why am I playing as this beefcake? After you walk with this guy named Owen, you get to the edge of a cliff that oversees Jackson.
Assuming he's in there, how do we get to him?
We can corner one of the patrols and get confirmation, and then, I don't know, maybe find a way to lure him out.
Not sure why we're playing the pronoun game here when it's completely obvious that they're talking about Joel. Alright, so I'm recording this audio after I've already recorded the main audio, so I'm actually incorrect here. I just recently discovered that they're actually specifically after Tommy, not Joel, just yet. Here's the scene.
Abby, when the moon comes
I
out.
found Joel's brother. He's at a settlement out in Wyoming.
So they're actually specifically after Tommy in the hopes that Tommy will maybe know where Joel is. So yeah, this doesn't really change much, but there is a thing later that I'll talk about when it happens.
What is going on with you?
Mel's pregnant.
Just like at the beginning, we see conversations between characters we barely know referring to characters and circumstances we've yet to meet or see. You have to get the player to care about these characters first before you leave them with all these questions, or else it just comes off as obnoxious. Abby, out of anger, decides she'll try to find Joel herself. The next 10 to 15 minutes teaches the player the basics of stealth and combat. This is, for the most part, the same as the first game. Then it switches back to Ellie, where for the next 30 minutes to an hour is pretty slow and monotonous. The infected encounters are fun, but it's insufferable how in between combat encounters I'm forced to suffer through Dina and Ellie's flirting. Alright, that's a little harsh. Truthfully, their interactions can be cute. It's just that it's hard to be captivated by the beginning buddings of a romance when it's clearly obvious they're both gonna fuck, which is exactly what happens. Abby almost gets swarmed by zombies until she's saved by Joel and Tommy. Whoa, well she was after Joel in the first place. I wonder if she's gonna have a change of heart now that the guy she's after just saved her. Oh, I guess not. Great! We've reached Joel's death, the most controversial story beat in the entire game. Alright, so Joel and Tommy are forced into a situation where they have to trust this random person they just saved. They follow Abby back to her camp because they literally have no other option. Abby's group is initially super friendly until Joel says his name.
Tommy, this is my brother.
Joe. Y'all act like you heard of us or something.
Okay, so as I said earlier about them specifically being after Tommy, it is actually kind of weird that they don't, like, Abby's friends don't perk up when Tommy mentions his name. They only perk up when Joel says his name. So this part's a little strange. It still doesn't really change the overall scene that much, but it just kind of odd. Then Abby blows his kneecap off and starts beating him to death with a golf club. A lot of people are understandably upset with how this turned out. Joel's death is supposed to be the catalyst that launches Ellie on a revenge quest, the actual start to the game. Now, if you're not a fan of that direction, that's completely fine. A lot of people just wanted another adventure of Joel and Ellie. And I know this to be true because when I looked up what all the haters thought were at least positives about the game, they always bring up how they loved Ellie's flashbacks, wherein which it's mostly just Ellie and Joel. I also can't blame people for thinking the whole game would be like that when the marketing blatantly lied to them. With all that being said, you can't claim this game is bad simply on the merits that it just didn't go in the direction you wanted it to. That's a personal preference, and trust me, I have tons of those with this game, but we have to critique this game on its own merits. I think everyone that went into part 2 with the expectations of it being another Joel and Ellie story were so upset that they became overly hostile of what the story was. I've legit seen people with criticisms like, could you imagine how bad it would be if you went into a Spider-Man movie where in the first 10 minutes they killed Peter Parker? These people clearly haven't watched Spider-Verse. There's nothing inherently wrong with killing off the main character to your story so that another character can take over, especially when that character has it coming. Another big criticism I see a lot is how strange it is that Joel so easily dropped his guard and gave his name to strangers. The simplest answer to this question is that Joel has lived in a relatively peaceful community for 4 years, so maybe he's not as hardened as he used to be. If that's the reason, and that seems to be based off what the director even said.
And people surprise us, right? People change, people evolve, people all the time. So it's like when the Joel that you see in the beginning of Last of Us Part 2, I mean, after the opening guitar scene, it's like that's 4 years of having lived in this community that's safe.
It is understandably annoying that this is character development that is shown off screen. As for giving up his name so easily, well, Tommy already did that earlier, so I don't think that's as big of a deal as people make it out to be.
Hey, I'm Tommy. That's Joel. What's your name?
Abby.
Abby, are you okay?
To be honest, this is like CinemaSins levels of criticism, so let's just talk about why this scene doesn't actually work in fuller context. Joel's death is effectively graphic and succeeds in making the player go through the same emotions as Ellie as she sees her father figure humiliated and beaten to death. After Abby beats Joel to death, Abby's group lets Ellie and Tommy live, which seems far-fetched, but we're shown later through Abby's perspective why exactly they did that. And for me, this is a good enough excuse.
Fucking kill you.
Whoa, what are you doing? Manny, cleaning up. No. We're here for him. That's it. It's too risky to leave them alive. Too fucking bad.
He's right. We can't have loose ends.
We killed them. We're no better than he was. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, look at my face.
Fuck your face. You should have been guarding the upstairs like I told you to. Move! Back up.
Calm down.
Or what? Back the fuck up!
Calm down!
Jordan! You shoot me?
Stop! We're done.
Later on, the game tries to get the player to empathize with these characters, which comes off as very strange when none of them at least try to cover up Ellie's eyes or something when Joel's being beaten to death right in front of her. Like, she's just screaming and begging them to stop and they're just like letting her watch. In full context, they just seem like horrible people. It feels like the developers just wanted to have the scene be as effective as possible without really like it making sense. Even though I knew Joel was going to die, I didn't expect it to happen so soon. This point in the game is only like 2 to 3 hours in. I'd say that's pretty ballsy of Naughty Dog. Ellie and the player at least get some closure by getting to explore Joel's really nice home. You can tell by the flowers and cards in front of his house that he really did make an impact on this community. It's a shame that we didn't get to see it. Then for some reason, Maria, Tommy's wife and leader of the Jackson settlement, tells Ellie, who is very much emotionally compromised, to go find and bring Tommy home, because Tommy left Jackson to go after Abby and her group himself. Maria telling Ellie to go after her husband, I think if anything, just shows that Maria is a really bad, terrible judge of character. Ellie and Dina head out to Seattle to catch up with Tommy and to also get revenge. After the high-octane adrenaline of watching Joel get bludgeoned to death, I figured the game's pace was going to start picking up. It did not. In fact, it became even slower. Of course, every well-crafted narrative has its peaks and valleys, but an unfortunate side effect of the survival game design is that when the player searches every nook and cranny to find every possible item, they might find themselves spending more time scavenging than actually playing the game. There's a really good balance between scavenging and combat in the first game that can be attributed to how linear it was. But in part 2, Naughty Dog designed some areas to be So open to the point where I almost want to call it semi-open world, and I think it's this game's greatest detriment in terms of gameplay and pace. Okay, let's look at the first semi-open area you explore. At this point in the game, your objective is to find some gasoline. You need gasoline so you can use it to fuel this generator that you can then use to open a gate and progress further. There's part of a broken city you can explore, and it's up to you as to where you begin to look. You're going to want to look through each available building anyways because the game rewards you for doing so. You'll go through the bank first where you'll encounter some infected and then pick up the shotgun. Afterwards, you'll likely go to the synagogue where you'll find a gasoline canister but with no gasoline. Next, the music store, which mostly just has this really cute cutscene. And then lastly, you go to the courthouse, which actually has the gasoline you need. Credit where credit is due, there is a clear effort here to naturally guide the player from place to place, and it's effective enough in doing so. With that being said, however, the way Naughty Dog approached designing these areas fundamentally hinders the balance between scavenging and combat as well as the game's pace. There's a lot more to this area than the 4 locations I just mentioned. What makes this worse is how big, detailed, and realistic the environments are. Yes, they're beautiful to look at, but when I was scavenging, it became overwhelming how much I had to focus to try and find items. Oh look, it's a plethora of cabinets and drawers. I guess I'll walk by each one to see if the triangle icon appears, only for it to open up and there to be nothing. This shit gave me a headache. Like seriously, Naughty Dog could cut back on the cabinets and drawers by like 70%, and I still think there'd be too many. Items have a tendency to just blend into the environment, so if you want an easy solution, just go to the accessibility settings and color contrast items to make them clearly visible. Is this a cop-out? I mean, sure, but it's there if you want it. The semi-open world design when utilizing this game was certainly well crafted, but it would have worked better in a different game. And I guess Naughty Dog thought so too to some extent because this first area is the only one that's this big. Also, a quick tidbit on the accessibility settings. Making games more accessible to those who are impaired is generally really awesome, and I would encourage other developers to follow Naughty Dog's footsteps. Well, except for the part where they overwork their employees. Don't do that. After you get the gasoline, you move to the next area. There you find 2 bodies that were done in by Tommy. Wait, did Tommy have to do the same puzzles that I did, or did he just somehow get here? Following Tommy's trail, Ellie and Dina are ambushed by the WLF. This next section is honestly my favorite in the entire game. The setup is fantastic. You're calmly riding down the street on your horse, then boom, Dina is dead, horse is dead, and now you're tied up in a school classroom. One of the people that killed Joel interrogates Ellie to find out if she came with more people. Then the guy who killed our horse comes in and talks about receiving orders from a guy named Isaac, who says to kill all trespassers. The music intensely builds up while the 2 guys argue whether they should kill Ellie, then the guy aims at Ellie's face, but is shot by Dina from the ceiling window. This whole scene is excellently shot. The other guy shoots at Dina to make her fall through the glass ceiling, like an idiot. In general, I'm usually against QuickTime events, but this QuickTime sequence is actually really intense and effective. This game so far has been pretty brutal and unexpected, so I actually wouldn't have been surprised if Dina actually did somehow die here. But you do save Dina in time by just brutally murdering this guy in front of the camera. Listening to this track while brutally killing people in a school environment, and there's also this like late 2000s movie color grading going on, made me feel like I was watching a Columbine documentary. This is the first time you encounter human enemies, and there is so much more depth to the combat than when you're killing infected. It also really helps that this section is linear, which makes it easier for the developers to program the AI so effectively. It feels natural how they come at you, because if they do find where you are, they'll make callouts to their buddies by name and ambush you. Now I know I already said this game is graphic, but that does not mean this game is not fun. Killing zombies is fun in its own right, but man, killing human AI is on a whole nother level. This level, though it is excellently designed, is unfortunately short-lived. Ellie and Dina escape by the skin of their teeth, with their new objective to find a woman named Leia, who's camped out at a TV station. The next major story beat doesn't happen for a while, so let's go more in depth critiquing the gameplay. Guns sound great and feel great to use, but I think the most satisfying aspect is when you get to add gun mods at crafting tables. Just look at how satisfying this is. If you can find enough nuts and bolts, you can do the typical video game gun upgrades. Better accuracy, faster reload time, or even adding a scope. You know, the usual stuff. Something I found to be really neat is that if you try to install gun upgrades while enemies are around, they can spot you while working at the bench and still try to kill you. A lot of games have it where if you're at an upgrade station or some sort of menu, just the act of accessing said menu can make you invulnerable. So when I found that to not be the case here, I thought that was really cool, and is an exemplary example of how well designed the AI is. Well, most of the time. I already mentioned how cool it is that human enemies will communicate with each other by making callouts and calling each other by names. and the effectiveness of how aggressive they are trying to ambush you is determined on what difficulty you're playing on. Though I do think it's a little dumb how easily they can lose you if you just leave their sights for a couple seconds. When you're playing on Grounded, which is the hardest difficulty, if they spot you for even a millisecond, you're fucking dead. Now let's talk about the AI of your partner.
Dina, you alright?
I can recall several times, especially when I was playing on Grounded, where I thought, oh hey, there's an enemy I missed. Well, I should be fine since my partner's right next to them and is more than capable of taking them out. And that's exactly what they don't do. Well, at least they're better at hiding than they were in the first game. Combat and stealth in The Last of Us was never unique, but the mechanics were so well polished that that's what made it fun. Same case in Part 2. Several aspects of combat and stealth have been built upon, like the ability to go prone, hide in grass, craft weapon mods on the fly, and overall, the more openness of traversing levels vertically. It's quite a feat in level design that these areas are so well made for combat yet still feel natural, like they were taken straight from the real world. Which, I mean, that is what happened. This is actually supposed to be Seattle after all. But you know what I mean. Out of every gameplay element The Last of Us Part 2 has to offer, I think the puzzles are definitely the weakest. That's probably because of how simplistic they are, because most of the time you're just going to be pulling dumpsters or finding codes for safes. There was this one time where if I wanted to go to this one room, I had to break the window and throw a rope over a pillar, and then swing on over. That was probably the only time I actually had to get creative, and is the most notable puzzle in the entire game. Speaking of, that rope mechanic is really cool, and really well animated. But it's only used like 3 to 4 times throughout the entire game, which I thought was a complete waste. Something that I find funny is that the way you upgrade your abilities is by shoving down pills you just got done scavenging throughout the environment. Like, you go through so many people's bathrooms and just like take as many pills as you can, and I guess like shoving them all down lets you have better accuracy. A minor story / gameplay element that I thought was pretty cool is checking through Ellie's journal entries. Often Ellie writes about how the journey is going, writes about her thoughts, draws some doodles, and she also writes some lyrics. Journals in video games are a small yet very effective storytelling device that I love to see. Alright, back to the story. Once Ellie and Dina reach the TV station, they see a gruesome sight left behind by a group called the Seraphites, or Scars. We'll talk more about them later. Turns out Leia was also killed by them, but at least Dina and Ellie have a new lead. One chase sequence later, and Ellie and Dina find themselves underground. This is where we're introduced to a new infected type called Shamblers. They're almost like an evolved version of bloaters, except Shamblers don't just, suicide bomb you, they just throw their bombs at you. You think a sequel that's still about a zombie apocalypse would maybe add more variety to the infected types? But the only new common infected types are Shamblers and Stalkers, which by their names you can tell that Stalkers are supposed to stalk you. Circumstances lead to Ellie revealing to Dina that she's immune, another chase sequence happens, and now we're at an abandoned theater, where Dina reveals that she's pregnant.
I think I'm pregnant.
I know it's minor, but I'll give some credits to the writing here. All the pregnancy signs that Dina was showing up until this point could have easily been mistaken as Dina being infected, which makes the reveal that she's pregnant actually surprising. I'll also note that I think Dina being pregnant is a way better plot point than if she was infected. Ellie, almost out of character, responds pretty harshly.
We could have still turned back.
I didn't know. I wasn't sure, okay? I didn't want to be a burden.
Well, you're a burden now, aren't you?
Overall, I think this is a really good scene. The "oh no, the person I'm traveling with is pregnant, should we turn back" trope is a bit played out, but if done effectively, it can work great for causing conflict in the story. Unfortunately, Naughty Dog doesn't really do anything with it. The obvious route to take with the pregnancy plot device is, of course, to have Dina and Ellie fight about needing to go back. Would Ellie abandon her pregnant girlfriend just to get revenge? At this point, Dina is actually totally fine to keep on going. Hell, she was still planning to leave with Ellie until Ellie told her like, oh, you seem kind of famished, maybe stay back and chill. Okay, well, if Dina is fine right now, surely the symptoms will get to a point where Ellie is forced to make a choice. And again, that doesn't really happen. When Ellie leaves off on her own to kill more of Abby's group, she is saved by Jesse. Which, at the moment, you think like, oh, it's Tommy, but it's Jesse, which is a surprise, but mostly is a surprise because you think, wait, how the fuck did Jesse get here? He must have been right behind Dina and Ellie when they left Jackson, because not only did he catch up, he ended up ahead of them. Ellie brings Jesse back to the theater, where she tells him that Dina is currently pregnant with his child. Jesse confronts Ellie about Dina's worsening condition, and Ellie pretty much agrees to abandon the revenge mission. The only reason they don't leave right away is because they still have to find Tommy. Later, when Ellie and Jesse head out again to try to find Tommy, it's probably the most argumentative Ellie gets. Ellie has a choice to either go with Jesse to either go find Tommy right away, or she can go to the aquarium where she heard that's where Abby is. Besides leaving Jesse to find Tommy on his own, It seems that the only purpose of the pregnancy reveal was to keep Dina out of commission from the story and gameplay. Taking away your AI partner is a good way to add difficulty and to make the player feel alone, but to not use Dina's pregnancy in a more interesting way was a huge wasted opportunity. I seem to be saying that a lot about this game. Honestly, what I thought was initially going to happen was that Jesse would come back to the theater, hear that Dina's pregnant, then start taking better care of her than Ellie, which would lead to them maybe both rekindling their relationship, and thus conflict. Ellie would be super cucked, and her obsession to kill Abby would drive Jesse and Dina away, leaving her all alone. Not only would it reinforce the game's theme of revenge, but it also would be a great callback to this line from the first game.
Being by myself. I'm scared of ending up alone.
From this point till Abby shows up, nothing of interest happens with Dina and Jesse. In fact, when she does show up, Abby immediately kills Jesse, and I honestly was impressed at how I felt literally nothing. And that's because Jesse just wasn't much of a developed character. It's strange too, because you spend more time with him than you do with any of the side characters in the first game, but they're just like, the characters in the first games are just written better, I guess. I am getting ahead of myself. When you do first arrive at the theater, Ellie has a flashback to a birthday she had with Joel. This flashback is almost exclusively dedicated to showing some cute back and forth between Joel and Ellie, as well as showing this incredibly beautiful scene. To sum it up, Joel takes Ellie to the museum, they both get into a shuttle, and he gives her a tape of one of the rocket launches. Again, another great callback to the first game.
Hey, I was thinking, I would have wanted to be an astronaut.
That a fact?
Yeah. Can you imagine being up there all by yourself? Would have been cool.
Then the flashback ends with some foreshadowing. I can understand why the detractors of this game at least like Ellie's flashbacks, because they are really good. They're great narrative beats that slowly reveal what happened between her and Joel. They're also the lowest point in the game in terms of gameplay, since most of the flashbacks are just you walking with another character. Oh, I forgot to mention, you also get to gruesomely kill dogs in this game, which apparently was like a controversy at one point. One of the major criticisms is that Ellie kills like thousands of people, but when it comes to like the actual people who kill Joel, she has reactions like this. Yay, I get to say the big word now. This is what's called little narrative dissonance, which is when there's a disconnect between a game's narrative and its gameplay. One moment you're playing as Ellie mowing down an army of people, but then a cutscene happens and Ellie has a panic attack over killing a pregnant woman. Listen, it's completely possible that the women she's killed up until this point could have also been pregnant, so I don't know, maybe have a line that's like, I'm killing like a lot of people, maybe they have families or something, but there's nothing like that to keep a consistency, so I don't know, it's dumb. Not just that, but in this scene when Ellie's having a panic attack, she leaves behind the map that leads right back to the abandoned theater, which is how Abby later is able to find them. This is so fucking stupid. Listen, Ellie has been in the apocalypse her whole life. Are you honestly telling me that she's just like, that something that can lead enemies back to her, she just like leaves on the ground? I mean, okay, she's having a panic attack, whatever. Would she not realize this when she goes back to the theater where she's like, wait, where's the map that I was using to like move around the Seattle? Oh god, I left it back at the aquarium. Oh god, I hope no one, like, at least then, like, maybe have them still be, like, on guard or something, like, Ellie be on guard. But no, like, Abby just shows up and completely surprises them. Alright, so Abby shows up seeking revenge for her dead friends, killing Jesse and presumably Tommy in the process. Now I get to point out another dumb thing Ellie does. Why in the hell did Ellie listen to Abby and come up with her hands in the air? That was perfectly good cover, just pop up with your gun pointed. There's literally no good reason for Ellie to do this. Other than, like, I don't know, maybe the writers wanted a contrived reason to, like, move the story forward. But even that doesn't really make any sense, since the encounter leads to Ellie and Abby fighting backstage anyways, so why even write it like this? At this point, the player has reached the climax, so anything could happen. Ellie might get her revenge and kill Abby, or maybe Abby will come out victorious.
You killed my friends. We let you both live. And you wasted it!
Dad? Dad?
You serious?
The game stops dead in its tracks, completely kills its own pacing, to show the player why Abby killed Joel. through a flashback no less. Why Abby killed Joel is a question that honestly could have gone unanswered, but I don't mind there being one. But this is how you're gonna do it? Really? It gets worse. This perspective shift is probably the most scrutinized story point in the entire game, and it's easy to understand why. Because from this point forward, you'll be playing as Abby for 8 to 10 hours. As soon as the game switched to Abby's perspective, it's immediately obvious what the game is trying to do. It's going to show us a sympathetic backstory that will make us understand Abby, therefore making us feel conflicted as to who we should be rooting for. The Last of Us Part 2 tries to do this, but fails miserably. I've already said that having Joel's actions from Part 1 come and bite him in the ass in the sequel is a great storyline to work with, and I think that much is well executed in Part 2. But if you are going to show the other side's perspective to get the player to sympathize or at least empathize with them, you'll need to stick the landing, especially if this aspect of the story is half the game. Showing me how great Abby's dad was before rescuing a zebra isn't going to make me care about him or Abby's motivation, when I find out that he's the one doctor you have to kill in the last game's final mission. Naughty Dog knew this wouldn't be enough to get the player to care about Abby, so after the flashback is over, you play as her from 3 days ago up until now. If you want to show the other side's perspective, sure, go for it. But Naughty Dog, why on earth would you structure your narrative like this? Even people who love this game think that structuring the story where you stop in the middle of the climax to show 8 hours of why the antagonist is the way that they are could have been handled a lot better. With this narrative structure, each new parallel in Abby's story becomes a lot harder to swallow. Oh look, Abby and Ellie are the same because they both have communities they belong to. Oh look, they both have friends and their own dramas to worry about. Each time a story beat like this happened in Abby's story, I felt like I was being bashed over the head with a baseball bat that said, "Hey, do you get it yet?" Yes, Naughty Dog, I got it. I got it hours ago, way before you felt the need to show me over and over again from Abby's perspective. I genuinely don't understand why Naughty Dog didn't just have the player go back and forth simultaneously between Abby and Ellie. The game does it at the very beginning in the prologue, but after that they decided to do this instead? The player has already seen Ellie kill all of Abby's friends, so now when you show me that guy I brutally stabbed in the neck, how he misses his girlfriend and likes to play on the PS Vita, all I'm thinking is, oh hey, it's that guy I brutally stabbed in the neck. There are videos on YouTube presenting The Last of Us Part 2's story in chronological order, and even though there are bits that could use some restructuring, it's definitely a more preferable way to consume this story. Presenting this story in chronological order doesn't just fix all the issues, there would still be a problem with how effective this game is at getting the player to care about Abby and her friends, especially when you consider how little screen time some of them get. But at the very least, I'll be wondering if this character I'm talking to as Abby is going to die by my hands when I'm playing as Ellie. Maybe then I'd actually might feel a sense of confliction. Fortunately for me, there's not as much to say about Abby's segment as there was with Ellie's. Both pretty much play the same for the most part, though Abby does get to fight a really cool Resident Evil boss. For me personally, I just didn't care for Abby's friends, or her love interest Owen. There's actually a point where the game shows the relationship between Abby and Owen through a flashback, even though we're already seeing Abby's whole perspective as a flashback, which means this segment in particular is literally a flashback within a flashback. Okay, if that's not a sign of horrible story structuring, I don't know what is. I did, however, care about Lev and Yara, who are 2 Seraphite deserters. About 1/4 into Abby's segment, Abby is kidnapped by the Seraphites. The Seraphites, or Scars, as I mentioned earlier, are a faction of religious zealots who have been at war with the WLF. This makes them the main human enemies you fight with as Abby. They first showed up in Ellie's segment, leaving quite the impression, but the group does receive more development in Abby's story. This scene where Lev and Yara save Abby is honestly one of the best scenes in the entire game, and the way it transitions into gameplay is perfect. So the reason Lev and Yara deserted the Seraphites is because Lev is trans. This becomes obvious later when Abby and him are fighting off Scar members, and they dead name Lev as Lily.
You should have stayed away, Lily!
I heard that there were people upset with the trans representation in this game, but I honestly don't see what the problem is. There's a conversation that Abby has with Yara about Lev being trans that I thought was very well done. It felt like a genuine conversation that could happen with anyone who has trans siblings and is growing up under a strict religious rule. Also, I personally think Lev is the best character in the entire game. Look how funny he is.
What's going on between you and your friend Owen?
Oh my god, Lev, now?
Abby basically rescues Lev and Yara, and while they're all hanging out at the aquarium, Owen wants everyone there to leave the WLF and chase a rumor about the Fireflies being in Santa Barbara. Before they all leave, Lev steals the boat to travel to the Seraphite Island to try and convince his mom to come with them. This obviously doesn't end well with the context we know about the mom. Conveniently, on the retrieval of getting Lev back, the entire Seraphite Island goes into war with the WLF, which does lead into a cool segment in the game where Abby and Lev are trying to escape the island, but with all this chaos and destruction that's happening around them. Oh right, I forgot to mention that Yara is basically shot and killed by the WLF and Isaac. Remember him? I mentioned him like way back in the video. Yeah, so he's like the leader of the WLF. Prior to this scene, it sort of felt like he was being built up as like a possible end of the game antagonist that maybe both Ellie and Abby would have to fight together, or something like that. But no, Yara was in Last Stand and shoots him. For someone that felt like they were being built up to be like kind of like this big baddie, they're completely underutilized. Abby and Lev make their escape off the island and both head back to the aquarium where they discover Owen and Mel are dead, as well as Ellie's map. Great, we're finally back to the climax. Credit to Naughty Dog, I thought for sure once you returned to the theater the game would shift back to Ellie's perspective, but they boldly keep the player playing as Abby. Well, at least they stuck to their guns. A cat and mouse fight ensues as Ellie and Abby find themselves backstage. Conceptually, I think this is really cool, having both main characters fight each other, but as I already said, with the story structure as well as how poorly executed Abby's segment is, it's hard to feel the impact Naughty Dog was going for here. It sucks because that feeling of conflict Naughty Dog wants the player to have, I felt a glimmer of it for a second. And it's a very interesting feeling to have while playing a video game, but ultimately, it just blew over me. Abby beats the shit out of Ellie, but right before she seeks vengeance by killing Dina, Lev calls for Abby's name, making her stop, and she doesn't go through with it. Which in my opinion is pretty decent character development. Abby already knows that seeking revenge doesn't make you feel any better. So seeing best boy Lev, the companion that has made Abby a better person, come through to her here is a good story beat. Abby tells Ellie that she never wants to see her again, and then leaves. I honestly don't think it would have been a bad choice to end the game here. It's conclusive enough to work, and probably would have had the game receive less backlash if it did. But we all know that's not what happened. It's now time for the final segment of the game, the epilogue. The juxtaposition from watching Abby beating Ellie and Dina within an inch of their lives to playing as Ellie in the countryside, running up goats where you can clearly see their balls dangling, is... I can't even describe it, but it gave me whiplash. Some time has passed, so Dina has already gave birth, and now Ellie and her live out in the country. If the game had ended a few minutes ago, it would have been a decent way to wrap up the story. But since there's an epilogue, clearly there's more story to tell. But is the rest of the story worth telling? It's not. Tommy swings by to pay a visit, which shows that Abby somehow missed his head and got his eye instead? Okay, based off this angle, it kind of seemed like he was for sure a goner, but okay. But whatever the case, Tommy tells Ellie about a lead he found on Abby. Ellie initially refuses, and Tommy has an out-of-character reaction.
I can't go.
I know.
All right. Reckon it's easy. Forget about her. You sitting all comfy way out here?
Hey.
I'll make her pay.
Tommy.
That's what you said when we got back to Jackson.
Tommy.
What a joke.
At the very beginning of the game, Tommy pleaded with Ellie to not go after Abby, and later was even fine with letting her live.
So they just get away with this?
Nobody wants that.
Yeah, but that's what's happening.
What if we get hit by hunters again?
Is this you talking or is this her?
It's a valid point. They got what they deserved.
But she gets to live.
Yeah. What a joke.
So what's with this dramatic change of heart? You know, it was probably character development that happened off screen, just like with the rest of this game. You can't even excuse his reaction as a necessary push to convince Ellie to go after Abby. Ellie eventually convinces herself to go anyways, so Tommy acting like this is not only out of nowhere, but also is unnecessary. Though it is definitely predictable that Ellie's gonna go after Abby, I do think this scene where she leaves Dina and their newborn is pretty great. Oh hey, it's that scene at the beginning of the game that was discussed by Jesse and Ellie. It's shown through a flashback and not till the end of the game, but at least we got some more context for it now. If you told me that this scene that was shown at an E3 trailer wouldn't be shown to the end of the game's epilogue, I think that you have played the game backwards. This flashback gives the impression that Ellie feels guilty that her last moments with Joel were, well, pretty angry. The perspective shifts back to Abby, where her and Lev find a radio to communicate with the Fireflies in Santa Barbara. Now with the confirmation that the Firefly rumor is true, they make their way. Until they get knocked out by a new group of antagonists. Why is this game introducing a third enemy faction this far into the game? Why not use leftover WLF members that blame Abby for Isaac's death or something, and they traveled across the country just to seek revenge? Isn't that a better option to reinforce the themes of the story? Whatever. Their perspective switches back to Ellie, where she finds Abby's and Lev's boat. Remember in the first game, as well as in this one, the game made a point to emphasize how much of a struggle it is to travel across the states, let alone the country, during the apocalypse? Well, apparently Ellie is just here. I can at least believe Lev and Abby did because of the time skip, but it just feels so abrupt how Ellie is just here. She makes her way through the Infected and this new faction of enemies, who by the way, are presented as so cartoonishly evil. Wow, the nuance this game was having with the WLF is just thrown right out the window, huh? Ellie releases some prisoners that this group was holding, and they tell her where Abby is. Ellie, through all her hardship, through all the horrible things she's done, leaving everything behind and traveling across the states to get to this point, finally finds Abby tied to a cross, malnourished and vulnerable. And what does Ellie do in this perfect scenario? One that's practically biblical? Ellie cuts Abby down and walks with her to a couple of boats on the side of the beach. But then, when she's putting her backpack on the boat, Ellie has a brain fart and remembers, oh yeah, I did literally every action in this game just so I could kill her. But instead of like shooting Abby when she's clearly distracted, Ellie decides that it's necessary to threaten Lev so Abby will fist fight her in knee-deep water? This setup is so forced that I can only view it as comical, which is a shame because I think the actual fight is genuinely great. Ellie and Abby tussle for a bit until Ellie overpowers Abby. And let's be honest, only because Abby is malnourished. This game has constantly been hammering over the player's head the theme of revenge, to the point where it's headache-inducing. And even though the setup to this fist fight is contrived, Ellie finally overpowers Abby and starts to drown her by her own hands. But then, she doesn't go through with it. Why? Because Ellie had a quick flashback of Joel, of course. Jesus Christ. So for more context, this flashback is shown in full at the end, where we see that Ellie was actually willing to forgive Joel. Even though this scene itself is also genuinely great, and adds a lot to Ellie's motivation to kill Abby, it doesn't make any sense for Ellie to recall this flashback right when she's about to kill Abby, and for it to be the thing that makes Ellie not go through with it, after everything that's happened. This is a narrative point that's honestly unbelievable. Ellie didn't get an insight on Abby's character, the player did. Maybe if that was the case, this would be more believable. But all Ellie knows about Abby is that she's the person that killed Joel, Jesse, and almost Dina and Tommy. Why would Ellie have a change of heart now, at this very moment? Why would she let Abby live after all the struggle to get here? Naughty Dog, why would you have Ellie let her live when it goes completely against the whole fucking point of the game? So Ellie didn't get her revenge, and also ends up all alone. I mean, you can do that, but only if Ellie letting Abby live is convincing. And it's really not. You know what I think would have been maybe a good alternative? Have this fight happen, but at the end have Abby still overpower Ellie. But then right before she kills Ellie, have her, I don't know, look at Lev and remember what Mel said?
You want to do right by these kids? Get out of their lives before you screw them over too.
Have Abby think that simply being around Lev puts him in danger, so then she'll ask Ellie to bring him to Jackson where he can be in a community that's safe. Abby, being very malnourished, tired, and vulnerable, could just ask Ellie to just end her life, because she's done. This would be a good reiteration of what Owen said about the guy he killed earlier in the game. I don't know, maybe have Abby say something like, I'd do anything for him, or something. And then Ellie could have that quick flash of Joel, then have that full realization that Abby is a person with her own story, or whatever. Maybe then, when she decides to let Abby live, it could actually be believable. Or hell, you know what? Still take the bold choice and have Ellie kill her. The conflict between Ellie and Lev can be dealt with in the next game. Or don't. It's completely believable that Lev wouldn't go on a revenge quest based off the type of personality he has. Besides Ellie threatening Lev, which is completely unnecessary and out of character, I think this idea of how the ending could have gone is so much better than what we got. With how this ending was executed, where Ellie just lets Abby live for no good reason, I feel like Naughty Dog only really did the ending this way just so they could use Abby and Lev for the sequel. As Ellie enters the country home, it's clear that Dina has left her. The game ends with Ellie walking away from the country home, with the camera focused on the guitar's moth imprint. When the credits rolled, I honestly didn't know what to think. I knew that this game had several narrative issues, but I also knew I didn't hate it. In fact, even though the story wasn't executed very well, and there's a lot of bad setups and a lot of off-screen developments, I still found myself appreciating that Naughty Dog tried something so ambitious, even if later they backpedaled. The simple act of trying to tell an ambitious story isn't enough to forgive its faults. but it does feel like no one is recognizing the chances that were taken here. My feelings about The Last of Us Part 2 are complicated, but I can understand why there are people who both love and hate this game so passionately. When all is said and done, I would still recommend at least trying out this game, if for nothing else than the well-polished gameplay. Funnily enough, I'd probably say the conversations surrounding this game are more interesting than its actual story. I wish we got this game with the same story, but with different characters. I wonder what the discourse would look like if that was the case. Unfortunately, we're probably going to be hearing about this game for some time. Doesn't help that it just recently won Game of the Year at the Game Awards. As much as I'd prefer Naughty Dog not making another Last of Us, I'd be lying if I didn't say I was curious as to where they take the story next, especially if it's still about these characters. Maybe next time, their message won't be so messy. Well, that was definitely a late video. Okay, so originally, I was planning to finish and post this back in like July, like a couple weeks after Part 2 released, but clearly, that didn't happen. I won't get too into it, but I haven't been doing nothing. I've been working on a secret project, as well as still scripting for other videos. My next video already has a lot of its script finished, so hopefully it'll come out a lot sooner than this one. It's a retrospective about the first season of Code Geass, which was, at one point, my favorite anime. Haven't made an anime video in a while, so I figured it's about time. If you like this video, and you want to support me, you can subscribe to my Patreon for $1 a month. 2020 was not a great year for anyone, but hopefully 2021 is a little better. I'll see you guys in the next video. Happy New Year.